All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And this is a special Thankstaking, Thankskilling, or Thanksgiving Day episode. And we are joined by two guests. We are joined by Alexander Reid and Damien Gagnon, and they are both Indigenous activists from British Columbia. And yeah, we are here to talk about all things Canada, all things Indigenous Affairs. And so, so let's get started. So first of all, Damien and Alex, thank you so much for joining us. And Alex, you're on the mute for the time being.
Oh yeah, it's just a habit. I'll keep it on mute while I'm not speaking, just in case.
Okay.
I'd be happy to let Damien take the lead on each question going forwards. He's pretty darn experienced with regard to Indigenous issues here.
All right, perfect. Okay, so let's get started. And thank you both, and thank you both so much for coming on. And all right, so the first question I have is, for anyone who's been living under a rock or simply doesn't follow Canadian topics or Indigenous affairs, can you explain what is the Wet'suwet'en resistance to a pipeline happening in your province of British Columbia? What's the latest news, and what's happening with the pipeline the Trudeau government bought from Trans-Canada?
So with regard to the Wet'suwet'en and their pipeline dispute, they've been involved in a number of pipeline disputes over the last little over a decade now, and they've been defending their territory up north in central northern BC here, up in near Houston there. And basically, up to this point, there have been 12 pipelines that have 12 pipeline companies that have tried to put pipelines through that territory. And they've successfully prevented 12 of those pipelines from going through that territory. And up to this point, Coastal Gaslink, which is owned by TC Energy, which is a Calgary-based company, is the 13th and final pipeline that's trying to be pushed through their territory. Now, up to this point, a large portion of the pipeline has already been laid, and the grounds have been cleared for the rest of the pipeline to be completed. In the last few weeks, it has gotten to the point where this pipeline has reached the sacred headwaters of the Wet'suwet'en territory there, Wet'zinqua, the river, which I'll note is one of the cleanest, most pristine pieces of drinking water in the world. The people there literally drink straight from this river. That is how clean it is. And
Okay.
Coastal GasLink wants to place this pipeline underneath this river, which is of great concern to the people of this region.
All righty, so, I see.
Absolutely. Is it all right if I smoke?
Yeah. Go right ahead. And Alex, anything you want to add to that, and what's the latest going on with the pipeline that Trudeau bought from Trans-Canada? And I think and was that related to the Keystone XL pipeline by any chance? Muted, Alex.
I don't know too much about the Keystone pipeline. Damien would know quite a bit more about that. Just to add to like the stuff about rivers, my brother, he's from the Wet'suwet'en territory, and I think it was out in Nisconlith, but what's his name? Nestle, that fucking bastard corporation, they bought the river. They bought the rights to the river in Nisconlith and drained it dry. And my brother's people had to find a new source of fishing and a new source of water, just because of how clean the waters were. And they drained that completely dry.
Wow, that's unbelievable. And Damien, what's going on with the pipeline that Justin Trudeau bought from Trans Canada? Do you know what's the latest news going on there? And I assume that the resistance to that is still very ongoing, right?
Yes, the resistance to the Trans Mountain Pipeline is definitely still ongoing, although it's not as publicized in the media as I would like to see it be. There aren't too many new developments with what's going on. Recently, they had to shut down some of the construction work that they've been doing on the pipeline here in BC as a result of the climate disasters that we've just recently had. But I'm not the most informed on TMX as some other people might be. My strong point is mostly regarding the Coastal Gaslink pipeline and the Wet'suwet'en struggle. But one thing that I can say is that the price tag and the burden on the taxpayer as a result of the TMX pipeline is gradually increasing as this dispute goes on.
And what's the latest that's happening with the Wet'suwet'en resistance? Because didn't the BC government and this is under an NDP government of John Horgan, is that his name?
Yes.
The premier of BC. What's the latest going on with the resistance and the forcible eviction of the water protectors, the land protectors, and their allies?
Well, about 2 weeks ago now, with the pipeline reaching the point where they're getting ready to drill under the the river there, the Wet'suwet'en brought a eviction notice to the workers of the Coastal Gaslink company there, and it was said that the Coastal Gaslink didn't inform the workers of this eviction notice, and part of the eviction notice was if the workers did not vacate the premises within the given time, the only access road to the region would be blockaded by the Wet'suwet'en. So the deadline came and passed and the workers did not leave. So subsequently the road was blockaded. And it's my understanding that Coastal Gaslink never informed their workers or gave them any notice of this eviction notice that had been given to the company. So, and a number of workers actually reached out to an Indigenous news agency, the Narwhal, to confirm that if they had been informed of this eviction notice, they would have left. But Coastal Gaslink chose not to inform them. And as a result, this blockade went up. So when the blockade went up during, and I want to note, this is during a climate disaster that's going on in the Lower Mainland here in British Columbia.
Yeah.
The government and the RCMP decided to send dozens of RCMP officers and helicopters and buses up to Wet'suwet'en territory, heavily armed. I saw photos of some of these guys holding what appeared to be assault rifles, going in on unarmed, peaceful protest or land defenders, arresting them, tearing them off of their land, which I might add is a violation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which was brought into BC law 2 years ago by John Horgan. So they're violating their own laws in doing this, let alone Wet'suwet'en law. It just blows my mind that this is what they're choosing to use their resources on, and the very thing that these people are trying to defend and fight against is this pipeline, which we know that pipelines and these oil companies are major contributors to the climate crises that are ongoing in the middle of an ongoing emergency here in our own province. And this is like it's just, it feels like we're in the Twilight Zone sometimes, you know? It's like hard to believe.
Yeah, and that's I was going to save this question for last, but it's a perfect but I think it's a perfect segue to this question of mine, which is which is if Canada stopped the construction of all these climate destructive extraction pipelines and all of the environmental apartheid, what is the alternative for Indigenous people to have constant electricity and clean, safe drinking water and so forth if it isn't through the extraction of fossil fuels? Because I imagine there must be a huge dilemma for some of the communities. Uh, because I imagine there's a dilemma for some of the communities to face, irrespective of sacred lands and cultural reasons, why communities reject any construction of pipelines and other forms of extraction, right?
Well, it's my understanding in a lot of these rural Indigenous communities that are oftentimes off of the provincial electric grid as it is to begin with. They're not, they often utilize, like in Wet'suwet'en territory, I know that they're utilizing solar energy on a lot of their buildings. And it's, I'm not a big advocate for solar energy across the national scale. I'm more of an advocate toward a nuclear energy, but
Really?
Yeah.
Well, before you explain the nuclear one, explain why you're not a huge fan of solar.
Well, I just want to enter the subject with clarifying that I'm not the most informed when it comes to solar energy.
Okay.
However, with my very limited understanding of how it works, it's my understanding that sometimes the issue of an overload with the amount of energy that these solar panels can produce on a large scale can sometimes prove problematic. So that's really the only reason I would have a hesitancy towards a large scale solar plan. But with that being said, I'm not the most educated on this subject of solar energy, so I don't want to speak as if I'm an expert or anything.
Well, I know that there are. Well, I also know that there are some problems when it comes to solar energy because of the usage of mining, which, of course, Canadian mining companies engage in lots of human rights abuses, as well as deadly environmental practices, as well as conserving the apartheid that exists in Canada. So,
once
so yeah,
Damien tackles once Damien tackles that bit, I'd add a little bit to that afterwards too.
Sure. So Damien, so sorry for interrupting. So explain, how Indigenous people can overcome the those issues where, because some people would argue, well, you guys are complaining about us extracting, us wanting to construct this pipeline, but many Indigenous people need electricity and so forth. So how do you overcome that argument?
That's a great question. I think that with the subject of how we could overcome, that kind of insecurity without electricity would be, it's, I'll be quite frank. It's not a question that I've given enough consideration to, if I'm being quite honest, and I'll have to admit ignorance on that. I'm more of involved with Indigenous land claims and such, and rights and title with regard to that, as opposed to say how we could go about actually obtaining different ways. I'm more of along the lines of a traditional line of thinking, living off of the land, although I realize that's obviously not that's not viable for everybody, certainly not. It's a subject I haven't given a lot of thought to, I'll be honest. And I apologize for that if
no worries.
That's not what you wanted to hear.
Well, at the end of the day, at the end of the day, the science says that we need to leave all fossil fuels extractions into the ground, and this building of this pipeline is going to be polluting the safe drinking water that the Wet'suwet'en people are fighting for. And again, on the front lines of of environmentalism are the Indigenous people, which is why which is why so many, which is why you're having so many allies. So we really hope that everything works out, and the Wet'suwet'en and people and their allies can shut this pipeline down. Otherwise, the more the more fossil fuels that we keep extracting, James Hansen of NASA says that it's going to be game over for the environment. And Alex, you wanted to contribute, so go right ahead.
Yeah, okay. So there's always kind of this dichotomy in Western media, and it always seems to pit Canadians and working class folks versus Indigenous people. And it's an absolute false dichotomy. There
Okay.
is no antagonism between these people. We both are oppressed by the Canadian ruling class, and our struggle is together. But it always, always, always pits us against each other, and it always gets Canadians to uphold these racist narratives and all that different stuff. But like, to tackle the question, there is no deficit of electricity. There is no deficit of access to it. It is just the privatization of it. Our hydro and our electricity grid is mostly owned by an American investor in Washington. All of British Columbia, BC Hydro is owned by some American prick. And like, just taking that back, just taking that from one rich bastard would do more than most of what Canada is willing to do towards reducing emissions and conserving electricity. But like, there's no massive shortage of electricity. But there's this idea that like we need to manufacture a ton more. They say, oh, we need to make so much more. We need to make access for everybody. It's a load of shit. The BC NDP, they took over the Site C area and they said, okay, we're going to put a dam here specifically to generate power for people. And they're completely full of it. That dam, the costs have ballooned. It went from 2 billion to 8 billion and now to 16 billion. And that $16 billion, it's not used to make publicly owned electricity. It's to develop a grid that is specifically going to support the development of power, specifically for LNG. So we have a $16 billion tax subsidy to support liquefied natural gas in this province.
Thanks
also,
so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Also, I was just looking up the numbers for some students yesterday, and in the pandemic in 2020, Canada spent 18 billion in supports for the oil and gas industry. And it's only estimated 30 billion at the low end to solve world hunger. So Canada could have subsidized and fed like 2/3 of the starving people in the world for the amount of money it allocated to climate devastation in the midst of a pandemic. There's no deficit. There's no lack of technology. There's no lack of not having the capacity to feed people, to house people, to protect people and keep people safe. But the ruling class is so content and so safe in this terrible, terrible, terrible focus on protecting and feeding the fossil fuel industry.
Unbelievable. And I got the volume to work. There was a problem on my end. My volume was too soft, so everything is going. So everything should be going smoothly from here on out. Alrighty, on to my second question, which is what's both of your understanding of Thanksgiving Day, in the U.S.? What's the real story, and what distinguishes the Canadian version? What are the myths and the real realities of it.
I'll let Alex answer that. I think he's probably the most informed on this one.
All right.
Okay, so I'm not too informed. I can tell you the reality and like the experience of the Canadian one. I don't know the history of it,
Go right
but
ahead.
the experience of it is very similar to the American one from what I've heard from a lot of people. But I can tell you the history of the American one too. But
Go right ahead.
so the American one, it's this happy story of like roughly 100 natives getting together with about 50 pilgrims. And it's this really happy kumbaya story where they took them in and fed them and did all this stuff and held hands and we're all happy. That's like the official happy narrative of welcoming settler colonists.
Exactly.
And that's like, there's parallels across that depending on what part of the American history that you're looking at. But it's actually not a happy story. Every single native who attended that gathering died from disease from the settler colonists.
Intention and they intentionally poisoned them, right? It wasn't just like an accident. They were intentionally poisoned, right?
I actually don't know, but I just know that like the narrative completely pops when you look at what happened. And like because I wrote a few things about that over the years, and like everybody's experience, they're just like, yeah, we don't really care about Thanksgiving. We just like care about getting together and care about having food, care about seeing family. And it's like, yeah, do that and whatever, but know the history. And there's a second history I'll mention in a minute, but like know the history and know that it's recognized as a day of mourning.
Exactly.
So the second history is that there was a huge battle. I can't remember the name of it, but there was 700 natives massacred. Most of them were running, most of them were women and children, and the US government slaughtered them. Right after that, some governor declared that it was a happy thing, that it was great, that it was this awesome thing. And then a while after that, Abraham Lincoln declared it as like a holiday. And it was like, oh, this is a great win for America. Let's be super grateful. Let's have fucking happy celebration where we get together and celebrate this genocide. We'll call it Thanksgiving.
Wow, unbelievable.
So
And
that's the American history. I don't know the Canadian history.
unbelievable. And what bit was it? Do you know by any chance if it was similar, the story of Thanksgiving in your neck of the wood in Canada, or?
From what I read, it said that like it was some religious event in Canada, and it's been going on for like hundreds of years. So I don't think it has any similar history.
Okay. So in Canada, Thanksgiving is not as offensive as it is in the United States, then.
It's kind of hard to answer that. I think it would be a little bit more offensive in the United States, but I really can't say. I haven't thought about that very much.
Well, that's a perfect segue then into actually, before we talk about past/current affairs, I wanted to know what's the latest legal action that justice groups are doing regarding the hospital in Quebec, which was found guilty of racism and the sort of negligent homicide of an Indigenous woman who died under their care. The woman who was grossly mistreated and filmed the racist treatment of the doctors before she died. What's the latest legal action going on with that? Because I know that the hospital was found guilty of institutional racism. . 。
I haven't followed that case or the aftermath of that case.
Okay. Damon, any knowledge of it or?
I haven't followed it very closely. I'm not I'm not familiar with any recent legal challenges with regard to that case. So, however, I will add that about a month ago, I believe it was now, the coroner in Quebec had declared that it was, in fact, her death was a result of her being an Indigenous person, and that action was needed to be taken to address the systemic racism within the Quebec medical system.
Yeah, and of course, this is not an aberration, but this is just part of a very deadly pattern of medical racism, which Indigenous and Black people, have to deal with, sadly, constantly in Canada, right?
Oh, I got a thing related to that.
Yeah,
I got two things related to that, actually.
Yeah, go right ahead.
The first one was just related to Quebec. During the really, really big escalation of the Wet'suwet'en struggle in the winter of 2019,
yeah,
I got banned for my 5th or 6th time for being really frustrated with Canadians. And that ban specifically was for highlighting a montage of Canadians' comments. And all of these comments were about killing Indigenous people, running them over with trucks, saying they should get hit by trains, saying they should be shot, saying they should be gassed, all these types of things. And I read hundreds of these comments and I was fucking furious. CBC had to disable the comment section in their Facebook articles because it was too loaded with racist comments.
Wow.
And from what I saw, roughly 40% of those comments, of those hundreds of comments that I read, roughly 40% was Albertan people and roughly 40% was Quebec people.
Unbelievable.
And the second thing, oh, sorry, go ahead.
But you were the one that got banned from social media for highlighting all of that.
Yeah, I posted a montage of it and I said, people think that Canadians are friendly. This is how Canadians are. They're fake, they're friendly on the surface, but they uphold wild fucking settler colonial violence. They don't give a flying fuck about marginalized people, and they think they're progressive because they measure themselves by looking at Americans. Like the bar is in hell if you're using that as your standard metric.
Well, spot on. And what was the other thing that you wanted to address?
The other thing I wanted to mention, a quick word on the medical field.
Yes.
It's like, I've heard so many things from women, from BIPOC, from trans folks, from gender non-conforming friends about the medical industry and how unbelievably violent it is towards those people. And I've heard lots of it over the years. And I went in for a nose surgery a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And right before I went in, I was really frustrated and angry about the medical field in this country and across North America too. So I made a post and I said, hey, share a bad experience you had with the medical industry, the medical field. And that post got fucking flooded. Over a day and a half, that post got 300 comments, almost 300 personal testimonies of unbelievable racism, transphobia, homophobia, and ableism especially. Ableism within the medical community is absolutely fucking brilliant. And I was just learning from my one friend about it, and I brought it up to my doctor the other day, and she was really, really not happy about it. But I didn't bring up the full post because I'm a jackass, and I did my friend a disservice by speaking without fully remembering the crux of what she was talking about. But I brought up part of what she was talking about. What she was fully talking about was saying that doctors shouldn't be paid as much. And then she had all the reasons behind it. And the reasons were that, like, first off, we need to get rid of status seekers. We need to get rid of doctors and medical personnel who are specifically there for status and power.
Yeah.
Those people do not have the best interests of the patient. Those people are there for their own personal interest. Another thing she was talking about like flooding the medical field with staff, getting everybody who wants to be a doctor in there. Instead of having this extremely gate-kept, extremely classist profession, instead of having this extremely long bullshit ableist trajectory that really, really, really protects the status quo and really protects men and white folks from becoming doctors. We need to get rid of that and get rid of barricades to every different demographic of people who would like to be a doctor, because those people are the people who know the struggle. Those people have revolutionary potential, and those people are the ones who are going to listen. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just about to say I completely agree with you, and that's definitely a topic that we should definitely return to sometime in the future, because yeah, we could definitely talk like for hours about medical racism. So yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome when but my doctor was not happy when I told her I don't believe doctors should be paid as much.
Of course they would be angry about that.
Yeah, I should have fully contextualized the post, but I just had a really good conversation with her for half an hour, so I didn't bother, but it was my mistake.
And can either of you talk about the epidemic and phenomena of murdered and missing Indigenous women? Why does this tragedy, I know this may sound stupid, but why does this tragedy exist? And what have the big taxpayer-funded investigations revealed so far of the murdered and missing Indigenous women of Canada?
I have a few things on this, but if Damien wants to go first, I can let him go first.
Cool, I appreciate that. Well, for me, the subject of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a subject that's very close to me. I have a number of family members who fall into that category, unfortunately. My great aunt, she was actually ended up being a victim of the notorious Robert Picton pig farm in the late 90s and early 2000s there. And a number of other.
Sorry to hear about that.
Thank you. And a number of other aunts and uncles who have turned up either missing or murdered under suspicious circumstances over the years. I was reading a book, and I forget who the author is, but it's titled The Highway of Tears, and it goes through a ton of really great information regarding the stories of the families of these women and girls who have gone missing over the decades. And what I found is very common with a lot of these cases is the first thing that the RCMP, the police, will say to these families when the case is brought to their attention, that they immediately jump to the assumption that these young Indigenous women or girls might be out partying, even if it's been over a week since they've been gone missing. Well, you know, why don't you just go home and wait to see if they turn up in a couple of days kind of response. Another very common response is that they might be down on the downtown east side, which is the poverty-stricken region of downtown Vancouver, where drug addiction and homelessness and poverty run rampant, unfortunately, as a result of the societal conditions that we have here in BC. But a private investigator actually went when a family was suggested that that's where their daughter might be, and actually engaged with hundreds of homeless people on the streets, asking them if they had seen this young woman. And he quickly found out that the homeless population, they all know each other very well to a certain extent. And if somebody was missing in that group of people, they would be the first people that would know about it. And it's almost every time that this gets brought up, they say the same thing. No, you know, she's not here. Like, sorry. And the RCMP and the government refuse to look any further past that. They look at these women as if they're all drug addicts, they're all alcoholics, they're all whores, and it's outrageous. You know, even my aunt, who was ended up at the pig farm, she wasn't a prostitute. She had drug problems, certainly, but she wasn't a prostitute. My family knows that. But that's what the police determined, that you know, she was just another prostitute that he picked up off the streets, and I left it at that. And you know, the crazy thing is, despite her teeth, articles of her clothing being found at the farm, she's still considered missing. They never concluded that that's where her body ended up. They never concluded that she was murdered, despite the evidence to suggest that she was. So the legal system with regard to young Indigenous women and girls it's rigged against them from day one. And you know, I couldn't imagine what it would be like living with that kind of fear constantly, not knowing, you know, could one of them be, could I be the next one, right? Because I'm not, you know, that's not an experience that I go through. I'm a man, right? But I see it in my friends' eyes too, you know, the fear that they have, and it's disheartening, you know, it's heartbreaking.
And the phenomenon of you know, of murdered and missing Indigenous women. So are a lot of the you know, the predators and you know, and the people who target these women, are they you know, are they often, you know, white people, white Canadians, or even Americans completely outside of the reservation that deliberately targets Indigenous people? And this is why, like, you know, the police have been unable to well, you know, the police and the authorities at large have been you know, unable to find out who these people are? Or is it a combination of that plus the simple negligence, which is related to institutional racism of the police that you just described with your great aunt, who was a victim of Pinkerton, who was a famous serial killer who targeted not just Indigenous women, but all sorts of all sorts of women, women who were on the wrong side of the law, but also just, you know, in general, very vulnerable women, right?
Oh, well, absolutely. And I think one of the largest problems is with these the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. A lot of the rates are significantly higher in northern rural regions where industrial man camps have been set up, which often attract younger white men who come into these communities, who often have whatever kind of problems that they might have, and whatever kind of people that line of work attracts, you know, hard, rugged work in the mountains kind of deal, and the subsequent mentality that goes along with that. I've heard there's
people who work people who work in the extractivist economy, pipelines and whatnots, or logging.
Absolutely, and then that's not to necessarily say anything negative against the line of work itself. If it were a bit more what's the word,
more oversights,
yeah, more regulations, more ethical practices. But the way that it's set up right now, a culture of misogyny and white supremacy runs rampant in this industry, and it's extremely unfortunate, and it's a result of these man camps being set up in these rural communities. And these people have very little regard for the land that they're on, or the people who inhabit the land that they're on. And that's, I think, and that's part of the pipeline dispute as well, is you know, a lot of these people are genuinely afraid of the workers who come into these territories, and the crime that follows. And I don't have the exact stats with me, or remember them right now, but I do know that the stats of assault, sexual assault, and even rape and murder go up significantly whenever one of these man camps are established in a rural Indigenous community.
Wow. Alex, anything you want to add?
Yeah. I had wondered about the relationship between oil workers and violence against Indigenous people for a long time. And then I was discussing it one day with one of my teachers, And he said that his partner is actually doing her PhD on communication and specifically studying the propaganda of the oil industry and the effect it has on young workers. And because so much what I've seen for a long time, I've seen these young oil workers, and I guess older oil workers too, this culture of cocaine, this culture of testosterone, and this culture of self-destruction. And I really began to wonder about it, and it really began to make sense to me after I thought about it for a long time. Oil is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly full of money. It's incredibly full of power. It runs entire countries, the oil lobby. The oil lobby has more power than basically all the voters in this country. So in order to protect its continued exploitation and its continued robbery, it needs to make sure its workers have no fucking soul, no solidarity, no care for anybody, no development as a human being, and no connection with Indigenous people, the land, the working class, anybody. So what we see is the specific tendency of man camps. You can Google man camps and read about it and see the direct studies, the direct proof, the direct things that show directly this leads to misogyny, sexual violence, and murder. But just a kind of primer to understand and think about that. You have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands of young people living together, working their fucking asses off, and then being frustrated and alienated and filled with propaganda. They are absolutely filled to the brim with propaganda about how hard they work. And that really, really leaves a fascist undertone of hating disabled people. But there's this really, really, really intense propaganda push to divide men and women and to maintain social inequality and to really, really be anti-communist and just against solidarity. I'd also like to mention the violence against Indigenous women. Indigenous women exist at the intersect of misogyny, at the intersect of racism, and largely at the intersect of classism. Women are not the traditional beneficiaries of property. They're not the beneficiaries of labor relations. They're overwhelmingly exploited at every turn. And every industry they work in is underpaid, if it's paid at all. Across the world, there was a study showing that there was $10.9 trillion worth of domestic labor that women have done. Women and youth. Women, youth, elders, three incredibly marginalized groups of people. And the work they do is so incredibly important, but under capitalism, it is valued at zero. So Indigenous women, they suffer so fucking hard under the system because it upholds capitalism, it upholds cis heteropatriarchy, and it upholds white supremacy. They exist under the boot of each of these forces.
And that is a that is a perfect segue then to this question, which is apart from the intergenerational trauma, how does the legacy of residential schools live on in other forms in Canada, as well as the as well as the 60s scoop scandal? And I know officially the 60s scoop ended in the 80s, but the last residential school only closed in 1996. So how do both of these policies still manifest itself in current affairs in Canada?
Well, it's my understanding that the foster care system has taken the place of the residential school system for Indigenous children across Canada. I believe I read a report that suggested that more Indigenous children today are in foster care than Indigenous children were in residential schools at the height of the 60s scoop. And it's a subject that is continually just completely disregarded in the media, and most people in Canada are even unaware of this problem and often just jump to the conclusion of, well, if their children were taken, they must have been doing something wrong. When the reality of it is, I have an Indigenous friend who, I know Indigenous people who may have had drug problems in the past, clean themselves up before they had children, have children, and then the Ministry of Family and Child Development are going after them because of a drug addiction they had prior to them ever having children, and constantly being harassed with drug tests and other things like that. It's my understanding that recently, I forget which, it was up north somewhere in BC, and I forget exactly which group it was, but an Indigenous group up north asserted their sovereignty and rights over the ministry when one of the children was brought back from a foster home in Ontario. And basically when they'd gotten the child back for a visit for a week, they'd realized that the child had suffered a broken collarbone while in the custody of the foster family. And that's another thing that I want to highlight. This was a family in northern BC, and their child was taken from them and sent all the way across the country to Ontario. And this legacy still goes on, and there's very little regard for an oversight over which homes these children end up in. It's common for a lot of these children to get shuffled from home to home, and the amount
to even be abused by the non-Indigenous families that are taking care of them.
Well, absolutely. Abuse and even in families that aren't necessarily being deliberately negligent, but just the cultural misunderstanding from the perspective of trying to raise an Indigenous child and what kind of needs to happen for that child. I'm a strong believer that our children need to be involved in our culture and our traditions and our way of life. And these are things that are integral, and our spirituality, and these are things that are integral to who we are, and they help make up our identity. And when these children are completely separated from their entire community and anything that, goes along with who they are and where they belong, it can be very confusing. For me, I wasn't separated from my family through the foster care system. However, as a result of circumstances, I ended up with, because I'm a mixed Indigenous person, so I ended up with the white side of my family. So for my whole life, I didn't give it a lot of consideration that I was Indigenous. However, I did feel like there was something missing from my life. I felt like, something wasn't right. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And it led me down this path of confusion, of not knowing who I was or where I belonged. And that followed me into adolescence. And I genuinely believe that if I had been exposed to my cultural practices, I would have maybe had a better chance of not going down the path of addiction that I subsequently went down in my youth. And that's not to say that, I just genuinely think that our children, they need to be in our culture, and they need to be in our way of life. We're here for a reason. We're here to be stewards of this land, and to separate us from that duty is wrong.
Is it safe to say that now, aren't there efforts by Indigenous groups that if an Indigenous child is is going to be taken care, is going to be taken away from their families, that if they are going to be put into foster care, they should be with an Indigenous family, as opposed to a non-Indigenous family in which their cultural in which their cultural traditions would be cut off from them, depending how long they would be stuck in the system.
Well, yes, and that's one of the primary points of the Indigenous group that was asserting their rights to have that child in care that I was mentioning earlier, of that child who was sent off to Ontario. Recently, that was their position, that they should be able to have this child in their own Indigenous form of youth care. And actually, it turned out that the judge in BC sided with the Indigenous group on this matter. So that's what they will be doing going forward, from my understanding. And I think that absolutely that should be the basis of how we handle these kinds of matters. If we have and this comes down a lot largely to federal funding. The government of Canada, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the Indigenous groups in this country, and they continually choose to underfund our communities withhold very needed resources, for the fact that this policy that they have in place, although it might not be a directly written policy that's in legislation, the mentality is they're still trying to eradicate the Indigenous people in this country. They're not concerned about the fact that there's a suicide epidemic taking place in Indigenous communities. They're not concerned about the fact that addiction run rampant in some Indigenous communities, and they have no resources to establish any kind of treatment center. They don't have the funds to do these kinds of things, and these funds are being withheld by the federal government from these communities, when it's the government's responsibility to make sure that the Indigenous people are taken care of and looked after. And it's very concerning, the efforts that are in place to prevent any change from happening in our communities, any progress. And when they say that they're going to bring in progress, they say that they're going to bring in the pipelines, and that'll bring money. But what people don't realize is, oftentimes, and a big subject with the Wet'suwet'en dispute, is the government says that it's the elected band council chiefs who are on board. And yes, that's true. The elected band council is on board. But a lot of people don't realize the elected band council is just a branch of the Colonial Indian Act. It's a branch of the government. It was imposed upon us by the government through the Indian Act. We never had elected band councils prior to colonization. We had our own systems of Indigenous governance in place. And the band council system was put in place to undermine these traditional systems of governance and remove us from our traditional ways of life and forcibly assimilate us to Western democratic culture, if you can call it democratic.
Unbelievable. Alex, anything you want to add? Is there anything you'd like to add to that? And here he is. We got an image.
Yeah, absolutely. When kind of understanding the legacy of residential schools, it really helps to take a long historic look. And that process, it's very similar to the Marxist process of understanding what came before it, what preceded it. And the Indigenous perception, one Indigenous perception of time and a Marxist perception of time are very similar, in that what happened before is attached to now. It's not some separated thing. It's not some cut and paste thing that exists in a museum. It is attached to now. So to understand the foster care system, you look at residential schools. To look at residential schools, you look at what came before them. And what came before them was religious schools. That began in the 16th century. So we have this 400-year history of state-sanctioned violence. State-sanctioned violence and corporate violence, before there was even a settler state here to implement that violence. So it's just been this 400-year history that has led to MCFD and the violence that is going on today. And Damien had the numbers exactly right. There is more kids taken from MCFD than from residential schools at their height. The official number was 52% of kids in the foster care system were Indigenous, even though Indigenous kids only comprised 7% of the population.
Unbelievable. That's just That's just simply unbelievable. And Elle Jones, she talked about she talked about once in a conversation with other Black Lives Matter and Native Lives Matter folk, and she talked about how social care and the welfare system and those who work in social care often act as a form of constant policing and social control of Indigenous and Black lives. And both of you sort of alluded to the neo-Dickensian, the classism that that Indigenous women and Indigenous people at large deal with. Can you talk a bit more about this?
About class-based violence?
Yeah, when it comes to like the social welfare, the social care system, and how that heavily persecutes Indigenous people.
I think Damien might know a little bit more, but I can give a little bit of context to.
Yeah, go right ahead.
A little bit of context. So with MCFD, you have foster parents, and they are funded much, much, much higher than birth parents. So you automatically have this pipeline of people who are at risk of losing their kids. You have a pipeline from them to people who want to adopt. And people who want to adopt are generally fairly well off. So you have people who are fairly well off being subsidized to take Indigenous kids and to take kids from other families. I talked to some random guy on the street, completely random native guy, when I was out with some friends. And within 5 minutes, he had told me that he had been taken by the foster care system, and he had started being abused by the foster care system when he was 2. And I don't think that is an uncommon story for most people who've been in the foster care system. It is really just the last stage of development of historic violence towards Indigenous people.
So, Damien, is it safe to say that the 60s scoop never ended?
Absolutely. It's still ongoing right now. And, I think that with regard to that, it's a bit of a slap in the face for the government of Canada to be trying to talk about reconciliation when these atrocities are still ongoing. How are we supposed to begin to reconcile with the past when it's not the past, it's the present?
Yeah. No, it's and yet Canada still seems to completely get away with this, right?
Well, absolutely. It's the lack of media attention that this subject gets. I genuinely believe that there's a concerted effort on behalf of the corporate media to prevent these kinds of stories from getting out, because they pose a threat to the kind of hegemony that Canada as an imperialist state holds. And that's the very reality of it. Is for a large part of history, it was America that was seen as this big imperialist power in the world. But in more recent years, Canada has also been following suit in a lot of, even in the international field of imperialism. And, I'm very concerned about the path that Canada's going down. I don't like it. And, as Alex mentioned earlier, it's going down the path of, these are the early signs of what fascism looks like.
Yeah, I completely agree. And before we get into that, I want to ask, what other forms of policing and police brutality are a constant reality for Indigenous people? And are most Indigenous people in prison for the pettiest of reasons, like nonviolent offenses such as consuming illegal drugs, what's deemed illegal, or a disturbance which got out of hand due to police violence? And where do you both stand on policing? Are you for abolitionism, abolishing the police, or reforming the police? And Yeah, and if you are for abolition, why that over simple police reforms?
Well, for me personally, I believe that the art, not necessarily the idea of abolishing an entire police force as an ideal, but more so abolishing the RCMP as an institution. And what that means is not just getting rid of any form of law enforcement in this country, but I think that the indigenous models of legal systems and justice systems are significantly more surrounded around equality and fairness than the oppressive and admittedly outdated justice system that this country has. And a lot of the laws in this country, a lot of people don't realize, are set up in a way to put marginalized people at a direct disadvantage, minorities at a direct disadvantage. Um, I genuinely think, and I'm speaking from the stance that a large part of the province that I live in is unceded territory, meaning that the indigenous people in this region, in large parts of this region, never surrendered the territory to the Canadian government in colonization. There were never any treaties signed handing over land. The government basically just marched in and took this as their own, and it's basically an occupation that has just become normalized in the international community. And I stand by our Indigenous laws per territory, and those vary per territory. But I genuinely believe that if we were, I believe that we should better involve the Indigenous governments in their nations here in Canada, and to try to set up a more, I don't know, a system of policing that just works. I don't know. I don't see that anything the police do is working. I mean, even in my own community, it's, the thing that I see is the police artificially manufacture crime rates, at least in my community. What they're doing is they'll send out a ridiculous amount of patrols to nab a bunch of petty crimes and property crime offenders. And then they'll go and say, well, look at how high the crime rates are. Look at how many people we're arresting. We need more cops. Then they get more cops. And then all of a sudden they say, well, we need more funding. And then they get more funding. And then it's just the same thing all over again, a cycle. And then after they get the funding, they say that the crime rates are going up and they need more cops and they need more money. And, the police are quickly becoming militarized, and I can see it with the increasing budgets. And that's, I don't see any reason why we need to continue on this cycle. I think that it's a system that's bound to collapse at some point. It's unmanageable. It's unsustainable.
And are most Indigenous people in prison for again the pettiest of reasons, like having a little bit of marijuana on them, or just there was a disturbance, like there was an argument going on between two family members or two neighbors, in which the police then get involved. And of course, because of the classist system, which is Canadian liberal democracy or Canadian plutocracy, you're talking about the foster care system, that all of that is simply interconnected. So so Indigenous people are just subjected to very much a cruel, racist, classist system, which is why Indigenous people are overrepresented in the in the prison population, right?
Well, absolutely. There was an incident about, I believe it was a little over a year ago now, where an Indigenous grandfather had brought his granddaughter into a bank in Vancouver, and I forget which bank it was very specifically, but what had ended up happening was the teller wouldn't accept their status card and believed that they weren't legitimate identifications, and the status card is the government issued ID, which indicates that we're status Indians in the government's words. And that's another thing that just blows my mind, on our fucking government issued IDs. Here we are, they're still calling us Indians, for Christ's sake. Like that right there highlights the racism in the system. But she refused to accept this status card, didn't believe it was a legitimate identification. and then ended up calling the police. The police arrive, handcuff this grandfather and the granddaughter, who I believe at the time was 11 years old, take them out to the streets. Little girl's crying. I believe he was handcuffed for over 20 minutes. And over what? Because the bank teller was too misinformed or too ignorant to know what a damn status card was, and putting this family through this kind of and it's not the same as what some people go through, but this little girl, in the aftermath, her grandfather that did an interview shortly after, saying she's terrified of police now. Cop car goes by with the sirens on, and she has a panic attack because their minds go back to that day when they were arrested for just trying to open up a bank account. And it's like, it's outrageous, the way that Indigenous people are treated by the legal system in this country.
So
That guy, that guy, he's actually from my nation. His name's Maxwell Johnson. He's an elder from here.
And Alex, are you also for are you like Al Jones, who's on here, that who's for abolishing the police, and how would you go about it?
Absolutely. So under the capitalist system, police exist to protect the exploitation of the working class by the ruling class. So we kind of grow up hearing that police protect people, police do this, yada, yada, yada. It's complete horseshit. You talk to any black people, any natives, any women, any gender non-conforming people, and you will see very fucking quickly that the police do not protect them. The police actually inflict tons of violence on them. Sexual violence and just kicking the shit out of them, as well as systemic violence, as well as abusing them in the police system, as well as all of that. So we have always seen that the police have not protected us. The RCMP specifically were mercenaries that existed to protect corporations before Canada even existed as a settler state. Mm-hmm. That institution is still here today. Over 150 years of those people being mercenaries for industry. And that's what we see today with the ongoing colonization of Wet'suwet'en. We see police going there in dozens and dozens and dozens with millions of taxpayer dollars, specifically to protect industry. They're not protecting people over there. They're specifically protecting gas profits and exploitation.
The real eco-terrorists, which is these people who are going to put another nail in the coffin when it comes to climate change, right?
Yeah, these people are driving climate change, and the police are protecting them to do it. But I'm absolutely for the abolition of police, and that's that could be a very long conversation, but I think I can do it really quickly. Most crime stems from a lack of material access to safety and things that enable people to be safe. Mm-hmm. People aren't out there like committing all types of violence for no reason. Like, the world isn't a libertarian hellhole where people are running around Mad Max style, just trying to do stuff and hurt people and steal. That's just propaganda that we've been fed to keep us divided and to keep us from knowing our neighbors. So as long as we know that like police don't actually protect us, then we get towards understanding where crime comes from and understanding what types of crime there are. So most crime that's investigated by police is property damage. Not the most important thing. There's all kinds of sexual violence. There's all kinds of domestic violence. There's all kinds of so many heinous things that have happened where police resources are absolutely not put towards. Police spend more time writing tickets and doing really mundane things like that. And it's the Canadian taxpayer dollars that fund that. So yeah, like most crime comes from people just trying to meet their needs. You know, you can walk around the downtown east side, which is internationally known as a hard place. I used to walk down there all the time. I worked down the street.
Yeah, that's the sort of Skid Row of Vancouver, right?
Yeah, I used to walk through there all the time. And the only time somebody ever fucked with me was actually about 5 blocks over. And it was some random ass white dude rambling nonsense. Like, the downtown east side is mostly like marginalized people, lots of drug users, lots of minorities, and lots of natives. In fact, the native population is 2.2% in Vancouver, but the indigenous population of homeless people is 38%. So there's this huge amount of indigenous homeless people there. And I never felt threatened by any of them. The only thing I felt for them was pain. Walking through there was so much pain and just so many people going through stuff. And you would think that because there's so many poor folks and so many people suffering, you would think it would be dangerous, but it's not. All those people, all their problems would go away if they had material access to the things they need, which is specifically housing, shelter, and safety. After that, the next important thing is education. But those are the core material things that we absolutely need in order to make sure that we're safe. Almost all crime will go away once humanity has access to education, to housing, to food, to safety, and just to the really important things that enable us to be okay.
I believe Tupac said it best. Instead of a war on poverty, we have a war on drugs so that the police can bother me. And Damien, before I get to my next question, you were mentioning that actually indigenous culture actually has the best way when it comes to dealing with with what's considered crime and the violence that comes with poverty and despair. Can you talk about what some of those about those indigenous approaches that the mainly white Western world should adopt?
Well, and I want to be clear, I certainly don't speak for all the indigenous groups in Canada, because they often will vary in the systems of governance and belief that they hold. However, I think that, one of the core systems in the way that we handle things is we look at these kinds of issues as a communal kind of issue. We don't look at this as, it's similar to what Alex was just describing there. A lot of the crime that occurs as a result of inadequate access to the resources that people need. And it's my understanding under an indigenous system of sustainability that a lot of the crime that we're faced with would honestly vanish, because I think it's important for people to understand, indigenous people have been here for thousands of years prior to colonization. And we were able to sustain everything the way that with what we had here in this country prior to industrialization, just fine. And it took about 400 years for that to just be fucking thrown down the tube because of the way that the Europeans are handling things in this country. And it's, I think that when the indigenous models of governance would be in place, and these better sustainability and better access to resources and a lack of food insecurity and housing insecurity, that a lot of these problems wouldn't really need a lot of attention, because they wouldn't exist, because people wouldn't be in the dire straits that they're in under this system of Western democracy that we have here today. But as for what the systems of indigenous justice systems, I'm not the most familiar with the specifics. I know that I actually am not the most informed on particular indigenous law. I know that we have very different laws. Most of our laws regard the land and respect and honor and those kinds of things. But with regard to an actual justice system, I couldn't say.
All right, interesting.
I can touch on that a little bit.
Go right ahead.
my friend, they did their bachelor's, the focus of their bachelor's was on criminology, and they shared with us a little while ago about the most effective institution in this country that deals with crime is Indigenous, and it's by far Western law is really focused on, or the institutions, it's really focused on dehumanizing people. It's really focused on just enforcing and dehumanizing and making them suffer. And the West is so comfortable with it because they buy into so many biblical ideas about suffering, about bearing a burden, and that everybody in jail is an evil person who needs to be locked away. The rates of recidivism in mainstream jail across North America is unbelievably high.
Yeah.
But that one Indigenous institution, the one that's most effective in Canada, it is absolutely opposite of that. It is really, really focused on community stuff, on cultural stuff, on spiritual stuff, and it has really, really successful results with what they set out to do. I can't remember the name of it, but it was really interesting to hear about. One quick funny thing I'll mention about Indigenous law with my nation back in the day, if you fucked up, you got kicked out of the village and you had to go live on an island by yourself. And everybody reported seeing red eyes and people with red eyes, and people would be fucking terrified when they came back from there, and it usually set them straight for a long time. And I think ultimately it's like, it's not the most inhumane thing, but it's really, really hard. And that's because humans are pro-social. We aren't these anti-social monsters running around. We are pro-social and we need human connection.
Yeah, which is why, which is why solitary confinement is torture and should be banned.
Absolutely.
And just out of curiosity, what are the voting patterns and behavior of Indigenous people in Canada? And Alex, you're definitely a Marxist. And why do you think members of your community should support the Communist Party of Canada? And what's the response from Indigenous people when you tell them how the CPC would address the grievances of Indigenous people? One which is allowing Indigenous nations the right to secede from the Federation if they wanted to. And Damien, is there a strong anti-imperialist attitude movement that's growing within Indigenous communities of Canada, or has it always been there?
I'll let Alex answer your first question there, and then I'll touch on the question you got there for me.
Perfect.
Sorry, could you reiterate your question?
So, okay, so the first half of my question is, what are the voting attitudes of most Indigenous people, and what's the response of of Indigenous people when you say something? Because I know you're a member of the Communist Party of Canada, and one of the big planks of the Communist Party of Canada is that if an Indigenous nation wanted to secede from the Federation, the Communist Party of Canada would would grant them that. So I'm curious, when you talk to Indigenous people about supporting the Communist Party of Canada and you explain to them that, I'm curious what's their what's their response to that? And do most Indigenous communities, do they support the NDP or do they support the Liberal Party, or what?
Okay, so, that's a lot of history. So rates of voting amongst Indigenous people are particularly low, which is something I'm extremely happy with.
Okay, interesting.
Extremely happy with. Most Canadians have really low votes of rating as well, but Indigenous people in particular have really low votes. And we need to look at the history to see why. So Damien alluded to the Indian Act, and that went into power in 1871, specifically undermining our democracy and giving us this fake colonial democracy. Canada has fake colonial democracy, and it has always served industry, even before this was a country. So with the bound council system, we have a direct look. We have it under a microscope. We get to live with it, like beside our fucking house. There's no going to Ottawa. There's no nothing. We get to experience day in and day out for decades and decades and decades the inadequacies of the colonial system that has been imposed. The system, it mirrors the Canadian system, which has one elected head and one body. It's immensely easy to bribe a very small body and one head. You can't bribe an entire nation, but you can bribe 10 people in a room. Likewise, you can bribe the Senate. It wouldn't take more than a couple $1 million to bribe the entire members of the Senate that you would need to. But you generally don't need to bribe the entire amount. You only need to get some people on board, and then more people get on board, and then it gets easier.
Yeah.
So you have that model living beside you. It's in your community. You bump into them at the store. You know these people. You know there's corruption, especially on the reservation where everybody knows everything that's going on. So we got to experience for a very, very long time that system doesn't work. That idea is touched on in a documentary called You Are on Indian Land, and it talks about this one border dispute. It's a really, really interesting video. And so, yeah, so Indigenous people don't vote very, very highly, and I'm really happy because they know the system is a colonial bullshit thing designed to keep us in place and designed to keep us from having political power. So I'm really glad that Indigenous people don't embrace that system and don't just say, oh no, we just need to vote NDP. Oh no, we have to vote for the lesser evil. Fuck the lesser evil. That is coercion, and that is a bullshit promise, and it is a bullshit premise. If it worked, it would have worked 500 years ago, and it hasn't.
But then, what's the response to Indigenous communities when you try to pitch to them the Communist Party of Canada, which would radically grant Indigenous people the right to true self-determination and decolonization and even independence from the Canadian Federation?
That is interesting because I haven't done it. I haven't done it at all, actually. Most of my time I just spend talking about like history, feminism, and capitalism. I touch on ongoing stuff towards climate and link that to capitalism. I really don't spend a lot of time trying to promote the Communist Party amongst my people yet, but I do mention them when I can and say, hey, actually, we don't need to vote NDP. We don't need to vote for a shell corporation or a shell party that ultimately serves neoliberalism and serves industry. There are alternatives. They're tiny, but the heart is in the right place. And if you want, they want the best. But like I haven't talked about that with much people. I mostly just talk about like feminism and history.
No problem. And Damien, I'm curious, what's your response to that? The Communist Party of Canada, who, hypothetically, if they were to get into power federally and provincially, they would abolish the Senate and completely, revolutionize democracy in Canada. But they would also grant they would also restore nationhood back to Indigenous communities. And if an Indigenous nation or Inuit or Métis wanted to secede from the Canadian Federation, Communist Party of Canada would definitely grant that. So I'm curious, your response to that.
Well, I'm a hardline Marxist-Leninist Maoist, so I fully support the Communist Party of Canada. I, yeah, I really don't have a lot of negative things to say. I think that a lot of their stances and a lot of their viewpoints are quite spot on. I haven't done the most research into their specific platform, and that's largely just out of the fact that it's not a mainstream kind of party at this point. So I haven't dedicated a lot of time, and I am a member of a separate Marxist organization. However, I don't. It's not a legitimate political party by any means, like the Communist Party. But yeah, no, I think that I don't vote. I didn't vote in the last election. On the grounds that I feel that the most of the mainstream parties are basically all the same. They're all just corporations, and they all have corporate interests, and they all have the same colonial interest at heart, as far as I'm concerned. And so, if the Communist Party were to start to go ahead in the polls, it's certainly a party that I would put my support behind.
And do you think most Indigenous people would jump at the idea of voting for the CPC because of that stance of giving Indigenous communities the right to secede from the Canadian Federation?
Well, absolutely. I think that that would be a strong sticking point, especially in unceded territories for a lot of Indigenous people. But for the personal experience that I have in discussing such concepts with my Indigenous friends, is I've found recently that a lot of the core principles to Marxism-Leninism are not so different than a lot of the core principles that a lot of our traditional beliefs hold in regard to sustainability and stewardship of the land, and looking out for each other, and so on, and then some of the other core Marxist philosophies. I think that a type of socialism with Indigenous characteristics could go very well in Canada.
I would definitely support it, as well as the eco-socialism of from an Indigenous left perspective as well. And then another follow-up question I wanted to ask then, which is you were talking about your opposition to Canadian imperialism, and I was wondering, in Indigenous communities, is there a growing anti-war, anti-imperialist movement growing within Indigenous communities, and attitudes growing within Indigenous communities in Canada?
Well, with the experience that I have, and in conversation with some of my Indigenous friends, for those of us who are informed and aware of what's our history and what's going on, there is a very inherent anti-imperialist motive to what we do, because a lot of what the Canadian government does here in Canada is inherently imperialist. Grabbing land, seizing resources for the sake of profitability, and then when they turn around and give any form of incentive to the band councils, they're being paid pennies on the dollar for what the resources are actually worth. So it's absolutely, I think that anti-imperialism and Indigenous activism do go hand in hand, but I think that it's also important to take into consideration for some Indigenous communities where the education systems are lacking, and people might not understand necessarily why they're experiencing the hardship that they experience, and not knowing where to direct this anger at is a huge issue. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for improving our education system, not just in particularly in rural Indigenous communities, but across Canada, because what we are taught in Canada is a bullshit imperialist history. we're taught that, our military is good and they fight for our freedom, much similar to what Alex was touching on with how the mentality around the idea of the police and, how they defend people. Well, in practice, they actually defend property and assets and value. And it's very similar with the military. And I think you got to take into consideration the extent to imperialism in Canada. The military was deployed. The literal armed forces were deployed in Oka in 1991 over a golf course expansion. Like that, I mean, imperialism is alive and well here in Canada today. So I think that to be involved with Indigenous activism is to be inherently anti-imperialist for sure.
Awesome. And
I would echo that too.
Go right ahead.
Mine's really short, and I'm just going to say that, like, oil corporations are driving imperialism. Oil corporations lobby for war. To be anti-oil is to be anti-imperialist. Oil corporations have such a firm hold on this country and its police. Directly resisting that is an anti-imperialist act. Now, we don't hear a lot of anti-imperialist ideas talking about internationalism, but I think just kind of understanding Canada to be a nation of many, many, many nations, it is anti-imperialist to support those different struggles as an international gesture.
And is it safe to say that the resistance to the pipeline, which the water protectors and land protectors of Wet'suwet'en are doing, that's inextricably linked to the anti-mining resistance movement in, say, Bolivia, or or the efforts to save the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and other parts of Latin America, in which Indigenous communities there are on the front lines of that as well, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but I know that the Indigenous folks are leading a lot of the environmental struggles, a lot of the anti-imperialist, anti-oil struggles, whether North America or South America. And Black folks are leading the different struggles against the state and against state-sanctioned violence and against the existence of the state itself in many, many countries.
Alrighty, my second to last question. My second to last question is the following: the apartheid legislation that is the Indian Act is still on the books. Why is a simple repeal of this racist law is not so simple? Surprisingly enough, Maxime Bernier of the far-right People's Party of Canada said if he was in power, he'd scrap the Indian Act. But why is it not so simple to just repeal the Indian Act for race relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to radically improve?
Well, it's my belief that with just the outright scrapping of the Indian Act without any form of without any plan would cause a lot of confusion, I suppose, within what's going on with regard to the legality around a lot of different groups, around a lot of the treaties in other parts of Canada, and I think that it would require a lot of consultation with the Indigenous groups across Canada, which there are many. So that in itself is an undertaking in itself. But I think it really just comes down to that, there has to be a firm plan in place with the Indigenous groups for what to replace it with, because it's just abolishing anything. There needs to be something to replace it. And that's not saying that it needs to be necessarily replaced with something that the Canadian government conjures up. I'm more so saying that, you know, there should be genuine consultation with every individual First Nation group across this country about what we want our relationship to look like with that group and the government of Canada. And it's a difficult subject, I think, and a difficult topic because of the different positions that so many First Nations groups holds across this country with regard to the Indian Act and the way that the system of governance has been imposed upon us.
Alex, your thoughts?
I only have a little bit to add to it because I don't know a whole lot about it. The little that I do know is that the fiduciary law is complex, and that I know that if Maxime Bernier wants to do something, there is some nefarious ass purpose behind that. But also looking at the history of it, you have Trudeau's dad, who tried to abolish and extinguish Indigenous rights and forcibly assimilate all Indigenous people. So I would imagine that is exactly what Maxime Bernier would try to do, and would gather a lot of support from fascist Canadians. So yeah, yeah, that white paper was something else.
And can you talk about that? Can you talk about how Trudeau's approach to the white paper, explain to our audience who may not know that, why that approach is sort of, sort of gets to the heart of why Damien was saying that, yeah, we would love to see the Indian Act abolished, but you can't just have a simple abolishing of the Indian Act because of, well, you can take it from there.
Okay, so yeah, like, to Canadians, it would make a lot of sense if they don't hate Canada, if they think that, like, the world is a fair place, if they think police do a good job, if they think you just got to work harder. If they hold all of those ideas, then to them, it would make sense to abolish the Indian Act. Even if their heart was in the right place, it would make sense to abolish the Indian Act if they were thinking that it'll get rid of the oppressive colonial infrastructure that we experience under it. But and it would only make sense because that would forcibly assimilate all of us. The legislation going in, it wouldn't be going in to support us. It would only be going in to oppress us further and assimilate us.
And talk about how about the white paper that Pierre Trudeau was a champion.
I can't remember too much about it. I was reading one book on it called Unsettling Canada, and it talked about it a little bit, and it just talked about how so many Canadians loved Pierre Trudeau, and then not many of them know that he tried extinguishing Indigenous title and extinguishing Indigenous people and forcibly assimilating all of us. The only good thing that happened from that was it sparked a huge, huge movement, a massive, massive movement from that.
Yeah, because was he trying because he was trying to basically abolish Indigenous people as a distinct race, as a distinct nation, and just making them just Canadian, like like the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and French Catholics such as him, right?
Yeah, so that's upholding like the 500-year history of violence here. Like that would have just ended it. They wouldn't have had to kill us all. They would have just passed that, and they would have had control over all of our resources forever. And we would have had no, from my understanding, we would have had no recourse if that happened.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Damien, by any chance?
Well, I think that, another thing that's worth noting is that, as highly flawed and oppressive as the Indian Act is in itself, some of the only rights that Indigenous people do hold are contained within the Indian Act, unfortunately. So in extinguishing and abolishing the act would also bring into question what rights we have as Indigenous people, because most of the Indian Act is related to these subjects. So I think that, yeah, without a proper kind of replacement in place to regard our rights and title in this country, that you know, it definitely could bring quite a bit of problems. And you know, as most Indigenous people know in this country, anytime the government of Canada comes in and tries to tell us that, you know, they're going to make some amendments and they're going to change some things for the better, it oftentimes is for the better for them, not for us.
Fascinating, fascinating.
A common thing when we first got the right to vote, disenfranchisement was a large part of the right to vote for Indigenous people. So what that meant was, if we wanted to vote in the Canadian elections in the old days, we had to give up our status card, which is imposed through the Indian Act. So through that, we lost our Indigenous rights and title, and our you know, we were officially assimilated within the Canadian. We were Canadian citizens, and it goes for the same with citizenship. If you wanted to be a citizen of Canada, I think it was up until the 50s. You had to give up your Indigenous status, and you couldn't use those rights. And you know, and there was a lot of incentive for giving up your status at that time period, because the government had imposed a ton of restrictions on what Indigenous people with status could and could not do. I believe up until the 30s, it was outlawed for Indigenous people to even hire a lawyer to dispute land claims, to dispute land claims with the government or municipalities or anything. So there was a large incentive for Indigenous people, unfortunately, to give up their rights and their status to assimilate within Canadian culture, which is, you know, an unfortunate legacy that this country has with the disenfranchisement.
Wow. The life of the life of Indigenous people, not just in Canada, but you know, Australia, the Sami people, and Native Americans, and to an extent in New Zealand. It's a real damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, is it not?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, I think that that's something important to highlight. You know, the Indigenous struggle in North America isn't so different from the Indigenous struggle in other countries and other parts of this world. And I firmly stand in solidarity with all of these Indigenous struggles, because I recognize we're all fighting against the very same enemy here.
All right, my final my final question, and it's a quick question there. And so, Damien, I'm going to start with you before we go. Before I go to Alex, and in memory of James Lipton, here's our question there. So, Damien, what is your favorite word?
Word? My favorite word is I like the word yo. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people might think it's an informal hello. But my people, the Kwakwaka'wakw people, in our language, Kwakwala, yo is actually the traditional hello. And we've been using this for thousands of years. And I like to use that in formal settings so that when people confront me on, well, why are you saying yo? I give them a little knowledge on my people's language. So that's probably my favorite word.
I'll remember that going forward when we keep in touch. What is your least favorite word?
That's a tough one. I haven't really given much thought to that.
Colonialism,
how's that a tough
right?
one? It must be Canada.
If I'm being honest, the first word that did come to mind was colonialism. So
okay.
Beautiful.
All right, David. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
just getting involved with my culture. Learning. I'm, like I mentioned earlier, I grew up disconnected from my culture, so whenever I'm able to learn more about my culture, engage with the music, the stories, anything that has to do with the indigenous community and our way of life, it fills me with a feeling that I can't quite describe. It's just ecstasy, I guess, is the word for it. It's nice.
What turns you off?
Liberalism. I think that modern liberalism as a whole is just, it's a cop out. It's a way of pretending to be progressive and on the left, when in reality it's just dangerously misconstrued understanding of history and dangerously misconstrued understanding of social relations and economic relations and class relations, and it's just a lot of ignorance. So yeah, liberalism is something that I do not like.
What is your? I completely agree with you. And what is your favorite curse word?
I use fuck a lot. Yeah, fuck's probably one.
What sound or noise do you love?
Sound of noise?
Yeah, what sound or noise do you love?
I like to hear the war whoops, the war cries that the indigenous people do. That's something, when my friends and I would be out looking for each other in town, we'd let out a loud cry, and we could usually find each other from that. So that sounds pretty nice, I think.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Police sirens.
What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
Oh, I would like to. I don't know. I'd like to be involved in politics, I guess. Try to make things better. I'm a tradesman, so it's not my favorite, but I do it because it pays.
What profession would you not like to do under any circumstances?
Think of a bunch of capitalist ones.
I don't know. I wouldn't like to work at a bank, that's for sure.
Likewise. And the last one for you, Damien, before we go to Alex, is if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You're all right about your indigenous beliefs.
All righty. Alex, on to you. What is your favorite word?
Shit. I really don't know. I had a really big list of words that I used to really like. And if I was smarter, I would have went back and found this list. But unfortunately, you can send a man to college, but you can't make him think.
You're far too harsh on yourself, Alex. What's your least favorite word then?
Either Canada or colonialism, or I don't know. I haven't thought too much about that.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Spiritually, I would say getting to go to cultural events and getting to just feel and see this entire range of things that is completely divorced from the experience Canadians have. Emotionally and creatively, I would say talking to people and hanging out with people is like the most stimulating thing for me. I have a lot of fun, and I can always guess when I'm messaging somebody that has ADHD, because it's so fun talking to them, and it's so fast paced, and it can go for so long and so fast. But like often when I talk to somebody, I'll literally talk to them for like 3 hours. Well, not often, but like often enough that it's like something to note that that's something I do because I enjoy it so much.
I find myself also liking that a lot. What turns you off?
Classism, patriarchy, people being miserable. I don't know. There's not a whole huge range of things that turn me off. I guess like anything associated with libertarians, anything associated with like people talking coked out of their minds, people talking out of their ass, people just rambling. Like if you're at a strip club and some dude's coked up and he rambles for like 15 minutes straight with a single breath, that turns me off big time.
What's your favorite curse word?
That's hard because like the English ones aren't very strong, I don't think. Like they're almost all built on some form of marginalized suffering. Fuck is like the most versatile, but it's too versatile for me to say it's my favorite.
Yeah.
I think my favorite would be a term in my language that means like somebody who speaks so much that it's offensive. Even if what they're saying is right, it's still offensive because they're a windbag.
I love that insult. I often use that insult a lot, windbag. How do you say it in your language then?
I can't pronounce it myself, but the concept of it's like my favorite thing ever.
What sound or noise do you love?
I'm not sure. I find rain to be a little bit relaxing. Rain on corrugated tin roof is pretty chill.
What sound or noise do you hate?
The alarm to go to work.
What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
I applied to work for the Coast Guard, and I always kind of would have liked some, like as a young dude, I really would have liked some like manly man role, saving people, yada yada yada.
Like Baywatch almost, or?
Yeah, I wanted to be a comedian too, but that dream has died. But I think if I were to do anything, I'd either like to be a comedian or work as a Coast Guard, because like there's not really many spaces to do some kind of work supporting like working class people and like saving people.
And what profession would you not like to do?
Selling cars or selling bonds or selling any type of thing that requires lying or manipulation or deception.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I'm really not sure about that one. Sorry, I do not have a good answer for that one.
Alrighty, fair enough. Well, if you do have an answer, you can always message me and I can always add it in the show notes. But alrighty, we are joined on this special Thanksgiving, or as my friend Solomon would say, Thankskilling Day, or as I like to say, Thanktaking Day. We are on this this special edition of 1+1, all things Canada and all things Indigenous Affairs with Damien Gagnon and Alexander Reid. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations on Indigenous Affairs. I would love to have you both back on, like this, or even one-on-one. And honestly, thank you so much for coming, especially coming on short notice. And I'll just end by saying, power to the people, death to settler colonialism, power to the people, and death to imperialism and the fascist pigs, right?
Right. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak on this subject.
It was an honor. It was a real honor, and and of course, power. Solidarity to the Wet'suwet'en people and all Indigenous people resisting these environmentally destructive policies, environmental apartheid, and Native Lives Matter. And it's great to see that that the left are champion. That the broad biracial left in Canada are champion Indigenous rights. So again, thank you both so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, comrade. I had a lot of fun.
Likewise.